Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Young here and welcome to a Metal Gear Solid 5 news update. Sorry I'm a little late with this one, I've been involved in this musical production, but that's over now. Anyways, recently Konami released another episode of Kojima Productions' Alert podcast, which mostly served to answer questions and clarify misconceptions. There's a lot to talk about, so without further ado, let's dive right into it. The first topic of conversation revolved around the amount of content that players can expect from Ground Zeroes. While they never give an exact number, the host did say that players can expect at least several hours worth of gameplay. They also clarified that the prologue is not just one mission, but rather several missions comprised of the main story and various side ops, and even after their completion they can be replayed again to tackle them in different ways, to complete challenges and trials, etc. Something else they noted was that Ground Zeroes is a different product from the Phantom Pain, meaning that it will contain different features. In other words, some stuff that's in Ground Zeroes may not end up in the Phantom Pain, although that mostly has to do with the fact that the Phantom Pain will be expanding upon its prologue. Then the host moved on by answering questions about some of the new mechanics that Kojima has introduced thus far. First up is Reflex mode, which according to them serves to simulate Snake's lightning reflexes, instinctive reactions, and complete badassery. But they emphasize that the feature is completely optional. In fact, the game will encourage players to retry missions without Reflex mode by rewarding them for completing missions with the feature turned off. They also go into why the feature was introduced in the first place, reiterating that it balances out the open world nature of the game, which makes it a lot easier to get spotted. They promise that even with the feature turned on, the game is not easy. Another gameplay feature that was discussed was the marking system, which essentially replaces the Soliton radar or any kind of on-screen UI that showed enemy locations in past games. Part of Kojima's goal with Metal Gear Solid 5 is to remove as much clutter on-screen as possible to enhance realism and immersion, which is why the feature was implemented. The feature also encourages players to scout and plan out their tactics before engaging missions to further simulate a stealth operation. Now, the feature has been often compared to the likes of Mark and Execute from Splinter Cell, but the host emphasized that unlike Mark and Execute, which served as a way to take down targets, the marking system in Metal Gear Solid 5 is used solely for intel gathering and nothing more. Apart from tactical advantage, the marking feature will provide no other gameplay advantages to the players. The host proceeded by answering one last question about the marking system. Some have been wondering whether one has to mark a target in order to use the Reflex mode feature, to which they replied that the marking system and Reflex mode act separately from each other. In other words, even if an enemy isn't marked, players will enter Reflex mode if they are detected, as long as the feature is turned on. The next topic revolved around lens flares, which, as most of you may know by now, aren't just there to give J.J. Abrams a boner, but also to help players avoid detection by letting them know from which direction they are about to be detected. What you may not know is that the feature will mostly be present only at night. According to the hosts, the feature essentially serves to balance out nighttime's much lower visibility. This likely means that during the daytime, since players have high visibility, the feature will likely not be featured often, if at all. The discussion then shifted to choppers, which play integral roles in Metal Gear Solid 5. They clarified that in Ground Zeroes, players will only have access to one chopper per mission, and there's actually a story explanation for these circumstances. Unfortunately, they were not at liberty to discuss these details. They also talked a bit about danger levels for landing zones. The more dangerous landing zones are much closer, but increase the chances of heavy retaliation, which could result in the destruction of the chopper, which will force players to exit the area through other, less convenient but slightly more badass methods. The safer landing zones, on the other hand, while they decrease the chances of retaliation, they are also significantly further away, so it's a balancing act. But choppers will work a little differently in the Phantom Pain. While the host didn't go into much detail, they did state that since the Phantom Pain brings back recruitment and base management, players will have access to multiple customizable choppers. The final topic of discussion was the game's aiming system. They began by clarifying a misconception that, to my knowledge, was first brought up by website IGN. The host emphasized that the game will not feature a lock-on system, contrary to what many were led to believe. The only reason it could have seemed that way to many is because the game was being played by one of the game's level designers, who is very good at the game, and who mastered the game's new bullet drop system, which was another topic of conversation. According to the hosts, Kojima wanted to make aim aiming more realistic by adding what's called the effective weapon range for every weapon. When weapons are within this range, the crosshair will turn red, and bullets are guaranteed to hit the target very close to where the player aims. But when weapons are outside of this range, the crosshair will remain white, meaning players will have to adjust their aim to make up for the bullet drop. If anything, the aiming system in this game is more difficult than any previous Metal Gear Solid games, but they promise that once players get used to it, the bullet drop makes shooting quite fun and satisfying. Also, bullet drop allows weapons to be balanced better, since in previous games the tranquilizer gun could, in ridiculous fashion, essentially shoot a tranquilizer dart all the way across the map if players lined up their aim. I can't wait to try out bullet drop, which so far seems to be a neat addition to the game that perfectly suits its stealthy style of gameplay. And with that, I would like to conclude this news update, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on Metal Gear Solid 5, be sure to join the nation and subscribe to Young Gear. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you very much, and Young out!